In 1941, Hitler fails to conquer Moscow. He gets his troops within sight of Moscow, but by continuing to deprioritize Moscow, ultimately, and because of the attack into the Balkans, ultimately Hitler loses the race with General Winter. And by the time General Winter kicks in, Hitler's forces are more than 20 miles west of Moscow. And then the Siberians and the Winter come in, and the T-34 tanks come in and drive the Germans back. What most people in the West expect is for Hitler to, early in 1942, once the rains have stopped turning the ground of Russia into basically an ocean of mud, for Hitler to resume the attack and take Moscow and also take the city of Leningrad, what used to be St. Petersburg, up here in the Gulf of Finland. However, and he's also taken Kiev, which is the capital of the Ukraine, and it's one of the, those are the three great cities of Western Russia. Kiev in the Ukraine, Moscow, and St. Petersburg. Hitler's got Kiev, he's close to Moscow, and he's basically in the outskirts of Leningrad. But then Hitler shows his genius. He's not going to fight a war like Napoleon. Again and again, he has this bugbear of Napoleon and his fixation on Moscow. And so Hitler is not going to follow Napoleon's example. He's going to, again, de-emphasize Moscow. Even though Moscow is now the center of Russian communications and rail networks in a way that it never was in the time of Napoleon. Shh, don't tell Hitler. So, I mean it. Hitler also decides not only not to go after Moscow, but not to go after Leningrad. His troops have fought within eyesight of the city of Leningrad. And yet, he says, nah, we will stop. We'll let the Finns take over the northern area as they reclaim their territory, which the Finns do. And between us and the Finns, we will starve the city of Leningrad. And from 1941 until 1944, that's exactly what they do. Well, actually, 1942 to 1943, it's 400, no, it's 900 days. Yeah, it's 900 days. It's 3 years. From 41 to 44, the city of Leningrad is besieged. Food cannot get in or get out except during the winter when the Russians can ship supplies across frozen Lake Ladoga past the Germans and the Finns into Leningrad. They can cross Ladoga, cross parts of the frozen Gulf of Finland, and sneak food in that way. But that is only during the coldest months of the year, when the Axis forces tend to be immobile anyway. Instead, Hitler is going to go after economic prizes. So in his Plan Blue of 1942, what Hitler is going to do is he is going to focus on the south of Russia, focus on the Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, and focus eastward towards the Caucasus Mountains, which we can see more close up here. Okay. Hitler sends his troops to Sevastopol, and then through Rostov. And his goal is the city of Baku on the Caspian Sea. Why? Because Baku is the center of Soviet oil production. If Hitler, whose only source of oil is the Ploiesti fields of Romania, is able to capture Baku and maintain supply lines across South Russia, Hitler will have a real advantage. He'll have enough oil and gasoline to really prosecute the war in a way that he has not been able to. I mean, the Germans make synthetic fuels, but they're not as good as the natural stuff. So the goal here is oil and also the breadbasket, the grain fields of South Russia. Now, as he sends his armies through Rostov in the early summer of 42, he realizes that he's got to cap his flank. He's got to protect it. And the biggest city north of Astrakhan on the Caspian Sea is the city of Stalingrad. Used to be called Tsaritsyn, city of the Tsars. It's now called Volgograd, the city of the Volga. But in the Civil War, Russian Civil War, Stalin did things personally here, and therefore this is called Stalingrad. It's like one of a dozen cities named after Stalin in Russia, but this is the most important one to Stalin. He actually spent time here during the Civil War. So what the Germans are going to do is they're going to move from Rostov across the Don River to Stalingrad, as the majority of their forces go south towards the Caucasus Mountains and the city of Baku. The army that marched into Paris in 1940, that led the march, is the 6th Army under General von Paulus. And von Paulus is given the job of seizing the tractor factory town of Stalingrad and holding it as the capstone of the eastern flank. With control of Stalingrad, the Germans can fortify the lower Volga, fortify the area between the Volga and the Don, this gap here, the Don River, and use the Don River up, and basically create a defensive perimeter, allowing them to exploit the materials. So, von Paulus's armies are sent eastward. But Hitler wants to get Baku fast. So, von Paulus's army is denuded of most of its tanks. Most of the tanks and mobile forces, the best troops in von Paulus's 6th Army, are taken away from 6th Army, and they're going to be made part of the attack southward. So von Paulus has a weakened army approaching Stalingrad in August of 1942. At first, it looks like it's going to be a fairly easy victory. The city of Stalingrad itself is this long area along the Volga, but it's not very deep. Along the western bank of the Volga, the city of Stalingrad isn't very deep at all. So what it looks like is, as the Germans come in, that they're going to be able to seize the entire city, and they'll have their flank position. In preparation for this, the Germans bomb the city to smithereens, creating a city of rubble, a city of ruins. However, because von Paulus's armies are weakened, and because furthermore the early summer was taken up with the siege of Sevastopol, von Paulus doesn't arrive until August, and he arrives with a weakened force, and the German bombing has only made Stalingrad easier to defend. The boss, the Borscht, Stalin himself, the man of steel, makes an order: not one step backward. Stalingrad is going to be the key. Stalingrad is going to be the city where the German attack is finally stopped. So, armies are diverted from everywhere else in Russia to come up on the eastern side of the Volga River and cross into Stalingrad by ferry. These troops are sent in by train. Some of them try coming down the river, but German aircraft are pretty nasty. And the short story version is the Germans only take parts of the city in the outskirts. They do not drive to the heart of the city where the ferry ports are. The Russians and the Germans are now in the same sort of battle of supplies that the British and the Germans were in North Africa, except the supplies are men, and Russia has more of them. Russians have two kinds of armies, then and now. There are guards armies, which are like any other army in the world. They're technically proficient, they have good equipment, they are designed to fight and win and live. And then there are shock armies. Shock armies are made up of convicts, of prisoners, of marked and doomed men. And shock armies specialize in human wave attacks, like World War I, bayonet charges. And they're not given much equipment. In fact, at key moments in Stalingrad, you had 5 ranks of troops, and only the first rank has a rifle and weapon and bullets. The second rank has bullets, and you wait for the first man to die, and then you pick up the rifle, load your bullets, and you shoot. Then you've got a few ranks behind them that don't have anything, and they're just going to wait until they spot a dead soldier's weapon and his bullets, and then he'll pick them up and continue the attack. This is brilliantly shown in one of the associated scenes that I'm going to have you view from the movie Enemy at the Gates, except they only have, they're in a lucky shock army. They have every other guy has a weapon and the other guy has just bullets. But there were times when it was 5 ranks, 6 ranks, 7 ranks. In any case, the Russians gamble that they can feed more men into Stalingrad than the Germans can kill. That's the calculus. The Germans now are in a street fight. I don't mean just a street fight in terms of nastiness. I mean they're doing street to street, house to house, room to room, sewer to sewer fighting. You could be in a building, a tenement, where the Germans are in one room and the Russians are in the other, and they're shooting blindly through the walls. This is up close and personal. Tanks are pretty much useless, or close to useless, in this kind of fight. And from August of 42 until January and February of 43, this grinding human wave of Russians comes across the river to stop the Germans. Now, the civilians in Stalingrad are ordered not to leave. They have to stay. Stalin's theory is, the civilians will stiffen the morale of the men. Basically, the civilians are trapped between both sides. It's unspeakable. It becomes a war of snipers. The Germans and the Russians have their best snipers fighting one another and using the cover of the ruined buildings. Again, the movie Enemy at the Gates is a wonderful picture of this. But as the winter comes, there's going to be a problem for the Germans. Hitler again and again tries to reinforce Stalingrad, but he really still wants Baku. But by the time the cold arrives, the German armies have not crossed the Caucasus significantly. Meanwhile, suddenly, there are problems. The Russians have armies north and east of Stalingrad. Germany does not have enough men to do all the attacks it's doing everywhere and guard this long flank. So it gets Hungarians, Italians, and Romanians, allies of the Germans, to guard these flanks. What the Russians do when the freeze really hits is they launch attacks from the north, from the south. As these attacks are happening, von Paulus begs to have his army withdraw and join up with the army here on the Don so it can fight again next year. But this time Hitler says not one step backward. Fatso Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, says we can supply Stalingrad from the air. He can't. Stalingrad is a bloodbath before the winter. The Germans try to reinforce and break through. But once the Russian lines meet, wrong color. Once the Russian lines meet, the Germans are not going to get anywhere near Stalingrad. And the circle, the ring around von Paulus closes and closes. The Germans run out of food. They run out of ammunition. They run out of medical supplies. They run out of warmth. Finally, near the end of January, beginning of February of 43, von Paulus is on the verge of considering surrender. Hitler promotes von Paulus to field marshal because no German field marshal in all history or Prussian field marshal has ever surrendered alive. What Hitler expects is for his men to die fighting and for von Paulus to swallow his Walther pistol and end it. The next day, after being promoted field marshal, von Paulus surrenders his army, what's left of it. And it's a tiny fraction of the army that marched confidently into the outskirts of Stalingrad 6 or 7 months ago. Of the men captured in Stalingrad, only a couple of hundred ever returned to Germany. So this is the biggest land battle and street fight in human history. And we'll see how bad it is in an associated video.